Making headlines for this week of December the 12th. Truth and Consequences. CIA report on torture is released and heavy global blowback begins. S&P gets wrapped. Ratings agency gets dealt a blow being linked to ratings scandal. Citizen disclosure, the next phase. With politicians being made aware, campaign ramps up with new petition to disclose, and consciousness creates reality. Science slowly conceding the truth that can no longer be ignored.
With news around, upon, within, and beyond our planet, the program making disclosure official. This is Cosmic Vision News. Here is Jeffrey West.
Greetings and blessings to all. For most listeners who have even glanced at other news sources over the last 3 to 4 days, it probably was not too hard to guess that this was going to be the news story of the week. It's going to be a long story, so let's start at the beginning. Spencer Ackerman, writing for the London Guardian last April, reported that the U.S. Senate had voted to declassify parts of the CIA torture report. Ackerman reported at the time that the vote was 11-3 in favor of declassifying at least parts of the document, an action that led to an unprecedented clash with the Central Intelligence Agency. One could argue that it took long enough. Since that time, various sources have allegedly been trying to prevent this report from seeing the light of day. Jump forward to last Tuesday, December the 9th, and RT reported that the executive summary of the roughly 6,000-page report was finally published by the Senate Intelligence Committee, for the first time exposing the panel's findings following a 4-year-long investigation conducted at a cost of more than $40 million. The chair of the Intelligence Committee, Senator Dianne Feinstein, was quoted in the article as saying that there may never be a right time to release this report. The instability we see today will not be resolved in months or years, but this report is too important to shelve indefinitely. RT went on to report that a fraction of the full report, the 480-page executive summary, contains the committee's conclusions concerning the post-9/11 tactics deployed by the CIA under the administration of U.S. President George W. Bush in an attempt to gain intelligence from suspected terrorists. Those techniques, including sleep deprivation and the simulated drowning practice known as waterboarding, have since been reined in by President Barack Obama. With respect to their impact, Senator Feinstein said previously that her panel's probe lent to critical questions about intelligence operations and oversight, and showed that the CIA undermined societal and constitutional values that we are very proud of. These comments are not a condemnation of the CIA as a whole, Feinstein told the Senate on Tuesday. The CIA plays an incredibly important part in our nation's security and has thousands of dedicated and talented employees. What we have found is that a surprisingly few people were responsible for designing, carrying out, and managing this program. RT spoke with a former CIA analyst who shared a few comments.
We did some things that were wrong. We did a whole lot of things that were right, but we tortured some folks.
The entire political establishment in Washington wants to avoid release of this torture report. The executive, the Congress, all are complicit. It's a very sad story because very powerful, very influential people were either witting or had witting knowledge of what was going on. So there's no incentive on anyone's part, including Dianne Feinstein, the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, to release this, even though she protests very patriotically and very piously that she really wants it to be out. She has the power to read that report into the record. She does not have the courage to do so.
There's already so much criticism that this report has been heavily redacted. Again, what is the point of it? Reportedly, John Kerry himself tried to delay the release of this report. But if we're not finding out anything new, what is the point?
Well, John Kerry's sort of overture here is the last in a whole series of comical things that would be funny if they weren't so serious. Is John Kerry suggesting that no one among the radical people fighting in the Middle East, that they don't know about CIA torture? Well, hello. A lot of them were tortured. What is trying to be prevented here is simply this, that the President of the United States authorized torture by executive memorandum of February 7, 2002, mistakenly released by his lawyer, Alberto Gonzalez. We have the text of the memo. It approved extraordinary techniques because we were going to treat captives of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, we were going to treat them in a way that was not in accord with the Geneva Conventions. So the operative language was, we shall treat such people humanely, as appropriate, and as consistent with military necessity. Well, hello. That's not what the Geneva Convention says. You treat them humanely, but you don't treat them as appropriate or as consistent with military necessity. Now, that was February 7, 2002. Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, had already issued an order like that. And then there was a catch-up game where people lied. People lied to the Justice Department and to the Congress to justify these techniques. And the following August, we had a list of techniques that come right out of the Gestapo manual. I kid you not. The Gestapo manual talked about verschärfte Vernehmung, sharpened interrogation. And the techniques were virtually the same, except for a few enhancements of the enhancement techniques that the Gestapo had settled on. And I have the Gestapo manual at home. I'm not making this up. So this was a travesty of justice. It was a blithe disregard for international law and our own national laws against torture, and everyone is involved. Barack Obama wasn't involved, but it's as though he were involved because he's so afraid. The country had a nervous breakdown on 9/11, and it's odd that George W. Bush started talking about evildoers, because that is the label that should be applied to him and to Donald Rumsfeld, to George Tenet, head of the CIA, and all these other people who let themselves be suborned into thinking they could torture people no matter whether it was immoral, no matter whether it made no sense from a collecting of good intelligence was concerned.
Right. So
Last thing I'll say about that.
What does this report change then? It's been over 10 years.
The report is very damning because Dianne Feinstein allowed her staffers to look into the record, to look into CIA records, and they found out that this was all authorized by various supervisors in the CIA. And so it's a very damning report. It shows that the CIA lied to Congress. It shows that the CIA lied to the Justice Department in achieving approval for these techniques on the grounds that they worked. And worst of all, it shows that the torture was not aimed at gaining accurate information. It was aimed at achieving the kind of evidence that would permit George W. Bush and Dick Cheney to prove that Al-Qaeda was being trained by Saddam Hussein. There was a link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein, and as a result of that, 69% of the American people believed that Saddam Hussein and Iraq were involved in 9/11 when we attacked Iraq. That's how cynical, that's how damaging, and that's how evildoerish this whole thing was.
The heavily redacted report did manage to release not just a few, but at least as many as 20 conclusions about the actions of the CIA in dealing with the torture of prisoners since 9/11. Here are just 10 of those conclusions from the Senate Intelligence Committee webpage. 1. The CIA's use of its enhanced interrogation techniques was not an effective means of acquiring intelligence or gaining cooperation from detainees. 2. The CIA's justification for the use of its enhanced interrogation techniques rested on inaccurate claims of their effectiveness. 3. The interrogations of CIA detainees were brutal and far worse than the CIA represented to policymakers and others. 4. The conditions of confinement for CIA detainees were harsher than the CIA had represented to policymakers and others. 5. The CIA repeatedly provided inaccurate information to the Department of Justice, impeding a proper legal analysis of the CIA's detention and interrogation program. 6. The CIA has actively avoided or impeded congressional oversight of the program. 7. The CIA coordinated the release of classified information to the media, including inaccurate information concerning the effectiveness of the CIA's enhanced interrogation techniques. 8. The CIA detainees were subjected to coercive interrogation techniques that had not been approved by the Department of Justice or had not been authorized by CIA headquarters. 9. The CIA rarely reprimanded or held personnel accountable for serious and significant violations, inappropriate activities, and systemic and individual management failures. And 10. The CIA's detention and interrogation program damaged the United States' standing in the world and resulted in other significant monetary and non-monetary costs. A Huffington Post article by Paul Blumenthal and Christina Wilkie focused on one other of the conclusions, writing that 2 psychologists were paid $81 million by the CIA to advise on and help implement its brutal interrogation program, targeting detainees in the War on Terror, according to the Senate report. The contract psychologists are identified with pseudonyms Grayson Swigert and Hammond Dunbar, like most of the individuals named on the intelligence report. Published reports dating back to 2007, however, identify the 2 men as James Elmer Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, both former members of the military. According to the documents released, Mitchell and Jessen played a key role in this grim chapter of American history. Articles on both Al Jazeera's and RT's websites had articles indicating that the U.S. would be facing a global backlash over the information contained in this report. Al Jazeera noted that Twitter users worldwide were reacting to the report using the hashtag CIA report and hashtag torture report. The latter was trending in the #1 position worldwide shortly after the report was released. RT reported that the U.S. is sure to face protests both at home and abroad after the Senate Intelligence Committee published this report, this according to Colonel Ann Wright, saying that the next step for Washington should be accountability. Perhaps not surprising to many people will be information reported by Anshel Pfeffer for Israel's Haaretz news website, who wrote that the scathing report published by the U.S. Intelligence Committee reveals that the CIA's lawyers used the rulings of Israel's Supreme Court to construct a legal case justifying torture. This article indicated that some CIA officers were concerned they may need legal justification for the interrogation methods they had begun using when questioning al-Qaeda suspects in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. As one might expect, the CIA and at least a few key figures were quick to jump on the defense of the practice of torture, claiming that it did provide intel and keep America safe. Mark Fallon, writing for Politico.com, noted the following: "It's official. Torture doesn't work. Waterboarding Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, did not, in fact, produce the intelligence that allowed us to get Osama bin Laden, as former Vice President Dick Cheney asserted in 2011. Fallon should know. He shares the following about himself: "I had since come to that conclusion myself, that torture doesn't work. As a special agent in charge of the Criminal Investigation Task Force with investigators and intelligence personnel at Guantanamo Bay, Afghanistan, and Iraq, I was privy to the information provided by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I was aware of no valuable information that came from waterboarding. and the Senate Intelligence Committee, which had access to all CIA documents related to the Enhanced Interrogation Program, has concluded that abusive techniques didn't help the hunt for bin Laden. Cheney's claim that the frequent waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed produced phenomenal results for us is simply false. The report is essential because it makes clear the legal, moral, and strategic costs of torture. Fallon offers guidance also in anticipation of people coming forward to argue against releasing the report, or those who will say that it kept Americans safe. Fallon writes that some have argued against releasing the report because they predict that it will spark anti-American anger around the world. Such a possibility, however, is an argument not against the kind of transparency and congressional oversight inherent to a well-functioning democracy. It's an argument against torture. Indeed, by employing such an argument, people are implicitly acknowledging that torture saps the country's credibility and threatens its national security. Over the coming days, you'll be hearing numerous torture defenders claim it kept Americans safe. Don't believe them, and this is Fallon still speaking. Many of us charged with the mission of getting information out of terrorists didn't resort to using torture. Like many Americans, we didn't want our government to use torture, and we hope it never does again. Fox News jumped all over the Democrats for releasing the report. An article on the Raw Story website about Fox News noted that Fox began trumpeting the line that the U.S., or the United States of America, is awesome in its attempt to demonize the Obama administration for harming the U.S. now. There appears to be sufficient doubt as to whether or not the release of this report will truly accomplish much, especially considering the timing of the release of this document, just ahead of a transition to a Republican-controlled House and Senate. Marcy Wheeler, an investigative journalist, spoke to the Real News Network to answer the question of why now, and also why she believes Obama cannot use this document to hold others in the previous government accountable.
Well, why now? Because Dianne Feinstein's about to cede the chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee to Richard Burr, who would bury it quickly. But I think the CIA's claims that this only provides part of the story is correct insofar as the White House has gotten the CIA to withhold a bunch of documents that implicate the Bush White House. So we know that George Bush wasn't fully read into this torture program, but we don't have all the details about, what the Bush White House did know, because Obama is keeping that secret, and that's pretty remarkable. But at the same time, the CIA claims that this isn't the story, that they needed to be interviewed and so on and so forth. But that would suggest that 6 million CIA documents are fraudulent. And I would suggest if that's the case, if that's what the CIA is now arguing, then that should be just as big a scandal, that these years and years and years of documentation don't reflect the reality of the torture program.
I wanted to get your response to the ACLU's Executive Director, Anthony D. Romero. And he said, this report definitively drags into the light the horrific details of illegal torture, details that both the Bush and Obama administration have worked hard to sweep under the rug. The government officials who authorized illegal activity need to be held accountable. The administration's current position, doing absolutely nothing, is tantamount to issuing tacit pardons. Went on to say, the report should shock President Obama and Congress into action to make sure that torture and cruelty are never used again.
I think a better lesson is, it is true that Obama has only issued executive orders to end the torture program, but I think the better lesson from this, and the reason why Obama won't pardon the torturers, as Romero suggested, is because he is still, or at least was as recently as 2012, relying on the same presidential order that authorized torture for his drone strikes. So in other words, this relationship in which the president orders the CIA to do stuff, the CIA goes completely out of control, mistakes the identity of people, kills them. That story is the same story whether you're talking about torture or whether you're talking about Obama's drone program. And Obama can't pardon Cheney and Addington and Tenet, because if he did, he would have to acknowledge that the same presidential order he still relies on was used to authorize war crimes. So he can't do that. And the bigger lesson, I think, needs to be that this entire structure whereby the president turns the CIA into this autonomous body that can run amok in the way it did in both the torture program and the drone program, that needs to be stopped. And it goes further than just the torture program.
The report will also have global implications also. An RT article on December the 11th has reported specifically on 7 nations that have been named and shamed in this report. According to RT, Afghanistan, Italy, Lithuania, Poland, Thailand, the UK, and Uzbekistan all stand to gain notoriety from this report. Even as far back as early April, it was reported by Antonia Malloy on the London Independent website that former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair knew in detail about the CIA's secret kidnap and interrogation program after the September the 11th attacks, a security source has told The Telegraph. The then Prime Minister and Jack Straw, his Foreign Secretary, were kept informed every step of the way by MI6 and were shown Bush administration legal opinions that declared enhanced interrogation techniques such as waterboarding and stress positions to be legal, the source said. The politicians took a very active interest indeed. They wanted to know everything. The politicians knew in detail about everything, the torture and the rendition. They could have said or told MI6 to stop it and do not get involved, but they did not at the time. A top UN expert has called for U.S. officials involved to be prosecuted. A news article by Samuel Oakford on the Vice News website quoted Ben Emerson, the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism and Human Rights, as saying that it is now time to take action. The individuals responsible for the criminal conspiracy revealed in today's report must be brought to justice and must face criminal penalties commensurate with the gravity of their crimes. Torture is a crime of universal jurisdiction. Although hard to pinpoint exactly what is going on in Washington these days, there may be evidence starting to show that at least some people are either finding the courage to start speaking out on what they know, or perhaps they are speaking out in order to save themselves from the nets that appear to be closing in more and more around Washington and those following a corrupt agenda. Most people who are familiar with the false flag scenario and the weapon of mass distraction trick may already be asking the question of whether or not there is something else being exposed, implemented, or covered up with a revelation like this now hitting the mainstream media. With this in the news, is there perhaps something else that is not being covered in order to keep the people from finding out? We may begin hearing about something like this in the coming weeks. Moving over to Israel, it should no longer be much of a surprise that countries around the world are beginning to turn against the Zionist leadership of Israel. There have been hints of a shift within the consciousness of the Israeli population over the last year. As mentioned recently on CVN, there have been soldiers, rabbis, members of the general public, and even some of the mainstream journalists have taken to speaking out against the leader of their own country. RT has reported on December the 8th that 3 of Israel's greatest living authors have added their names to an 878-signature petition calling on European parliaments to recognize the State of Palestine. Amos Oz, David Grossman, and Abraham Yehoshua all signed their names to the petition, which was sent to the European and Belgian parliaments on Sunday. Both bodies are expected to vote on resolutions to recognize Palestine later this month. Last month, Netanyahu received a slap across the face by more than 105 retired generals and intelligence chiefs, urging the leader to initiate a diplomatic process for peace with Palestine. The petition calls for both nations to recognize the other based on the borders that were in place on June 4, 1967. The RT article continues by adding that other prominent Israelis, including Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman, former Knesset Speaker Avraham Berg, former Minister Yossi Sarid, and former parliamentarian Moshe Raz, also signed the petition. Raz, the former Knesset member, told RT that a two-state solution supported by the international community was essential for the future of Israel, the future of Palestine, and the future of the people that live there. Simona Sharoni, a professor of gender and women's studies at Plattsburgh University in New York and the author of Gender and the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, The Politics of Women's Resistance, wrote an open letter to Jewish students that appeared on the Mondoweiss website. A portion of this letter reads as follows: I am writing to you because the Israel of my childhood and of your dreams has become a nightmare, which we can no longer ignore. The passing of the Jewish nation-state bill by the Israeli cabinet makes clear what Palestinian citizens of Israel have known for years, that Israel is a democracy for Jews only. By legalizing its apartheid policies, the Israeli government has forced us to reevaluate our relationship to Israel. Your college years represent an incredible opportunity, indeed a privilege, to broaden your intellectual horizons and to expand your knowledge beyond the confines of what you were exposed to growing up. She goes on to talk about her family and how her father was a Zionist Jew and the anger that he was unable to release. Sharoni closes by stating what so many are reluctant to admit. She writes, the Israeli cabinet's adoption of the Jewish nation-state bill is a rude wake-up call to Jews everywhere. The Israel of our dreams is an apartheid state, and its leaders seem certain that they have our support. It is time to wake up and speak up before it is too late. Jewish students on college campuses in the diaspora can set an example for their Jewish counterparts in Israel by holding Israel accountable and by insisting that it adheres to democratic principles and respects international law. In separate but related stories, several articles have appeared on the internet citing an aide to Russian President Putin as saying that the Israeli Mossad is actively training ISIL terrorists. This report comes from Press TV.
The senior aide to the Russian president has accused the Israeli spy agency Mossad of training the ISIL terrorists fighting in Iraq and in Syria. Alexander Prokhanov has told Press TV that Mossad is also likely to have transferred some of its spying experiences to the ISIL leadership. He said Israeli military advisors could be assisting the Takfiri terrorists. Prokhanov believes that ISIL is a byproduct of U.S. policies in the Middle East and that Washington is using the terror organization as a tool to threaten both Iran and Russia and intimidate Europe. On the issue of Western sanctions against Moscow over the Ukraine crisis, Prokhanov said that President Putin is not going to give in to pressure. He said that sanctions will only make Russians more resilient. Prokhanov also noted that the U.S. and its allies are using sanctions to make life hard for average Russians and to alienate them from President Putin. He said, however, that the sanctions have made Putin more popular than ever in Russia.
A Times of Israel article on December the 3rd also noted that the government of Sweden, the first Western European government to formally recognize Palestine, has now fallen, and that there will be new elections upcoming in March, immediately after an election in Israel. CVN is probably the first news program to raise the question as to whether or not Zionist interests had any part in the collapse of the Swedish government as punishment for their action in recognizing Palestine. Links to several other stories related to this will appear in the show summary for this particular story. In financial news, on December the 8th, there was some developing news in the financial world. Bloomberg carried the following report on their daily news briefing.
And hey there, Churchill. The story is just breaking. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is said to be seeking to suspend S&P, the credit rater, from rating commercial mortgage bonds. If that happens, that would be the agency's toughest action yet against a major credit rater. S&P's parent company, McGraw-Hill Financial, is still in talks over a possible settlement with the SEC, which has been investigating whether or not the firm bent rating criteria to win business back in 2011. This is all according to a person familiar with the matter. McGraw-Hill has declined to comment. The SEC has declined to comment. McGraw-Hill shares right now are falling on this breaking news that the SEC is seeking to suspend S&P from rating commercial mortgage bonds. Again, if this happens, this would be a very big slap on the wrist. We have been expecting some kind of punishment for the rating agencies, which have come under, of course, under a lot of criticism for fueling the financial crisis.
As Bloomberg's news anchor said, this could potentially be a big story, especially as more and more sources are starting to be held accountable for the global financial collapse that started back in 2008. This story is more than likely one part in the much larger series of events that are connected to the whole geoeconomic structure and change taking place at this time. What remains to be seen is whether this action being taken by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, is part of the aligned shift towards a new geoeconomic paradigm, or whether this event is a smokescreen, or perhaps even a setup to distract people away from something else taking place at this time. You heard moments ago in the Press TV report that an aide to Vladimir Putin was commenting on the sanctions being imposed against Russia and that they will not work. There is perhaps more evidence this week to support that statement. An article on the Ukraina.ru news website on December the 8th quoted Ajay Bisaria, the Joint Secretary at the Eurasia Division of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, as saying that India has made it clear that it will not adopt any economic sanctions against Russia. Bisaria had stated that both countries have a similar outlook on key global problems, including the threat of terrorism, adding that there is a need to ease the cold tensions which are appearing in global relationships more often. This should not come as much of a surprise, as India is a member of the BRICS alliance of countries, the group that is allegedly expanding as more and more countries seek to enter into various agreements with this alliance, which will further alienate and segregate the NATO countries, but especially the banking cabal group controlling the U.S. government and many Western governments. This alliance is moving further along in its plans to introduce its own international lending institution to compete against the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and next week it is being reported that testing will get underway. RT reported on December 8th that Russia's Rossiya and SMP banks, which fell under Western sanctions, are among the 8 lenders that will start testing the country's new national payment system on December 15th. The move comes as a part of Russia's ambitious initiative to move away from the Western dominance of its financial markets. Last month, the Russian central bank said it would have its own international interbank payment system, an alternative to the global SWIFT network, up and running by May of 2015. NPS was established in 2014 after a number of Russian banks were hit by U.S. and EU sanctions. In March, international payment systems Visa and MasterCard stopped servicing cards issued by the banks following the introduction of the sanctions. Most people are starting to acknowledge that something is going on within the oil industry. The question becomes exactly what that thing is that is happening. We know that there is growing movement for alternative energy sources. We are witnessing numerous countries that are making very progressive advances in the production and use of solar energy, for example. Alternative sources of fuel are starting to appear in automobiles in certain markets, particularly the European markets. There have been rumors and speculation that one of the key oil-producing nations, Saudi Arabia, was beginning to shift away from U.S.-focused oil cartel group or groups. Another article seems to speculate that Russia is going to suffer with the drop in the price of oil. There may be some doubt as to whether or not there is truth to this claim. RT had reported back in June that the worsening economic situation in Europe could bring Brent crude prices down to $50 per barrel this year, according to research prepared by Credit Suisse. Oil demand would deflate sharply following an acute crisis in confidence, say Credit Suisse analysts Jan Stewart and Stéphane Rivière. They predict the new phase of economic crisis to start over the summer. Prices have indeed been going down, and this is being reflected in the price of gas at the pumps in numerous countries. Pavel Koshkin, writing for Russia Direct on October 13th, wrote that some Russian experts argue that the headlong drop in oil prices amidst the increasing geopolitical risks in Eastern Europe and the Middle East brings about suspicions in the Kremlin for a reason. The idea that somebody is dumping oil prices cannot help coming to one's mind, said Professor Yakov Mirkin, head of the Department of International Capital Markets at the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of World Economy and International Relations. Whether it is true or not, said Mirkin, we will never know. Mirkin's suspicions may have become stronger after the OPEC meeting at the end of November. OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, chose not to cut oil production, even though the price of oil was going down. RT reported on December the 10th that OPEC has lost its competence as it failed to stabilize oil prices at the last meeting, according to Bank of America. It warns oil will slide to $50 a barrel, leading to wild prices where only rich Middle Eastern states like Saudi Arabia will benefit. Countries that don't possess vast reserves, such as Venezuela and Nigeria, will struggle to survive. The Telegraph quotes Francisco Blanch, Bank of America's head of commodity research. If we approach this from the 3D perspective, the perspective that exists within the current paradigm and thinking the world has been in, one might expect the oil cartel to drive up the price of oil as much as possible, so that big oil continues to pull in excessive revenues and profits, albeit with the consequence of greater destruction to our planet. This does not appear to be happening, however, so it may be safe to assume that something else is going on. So questions begin to form as to the strategy behind OPEC's decision to not cut production and thus allow the global price of oil to fall. Last week, CVN reported an article outlining the strategy of Russian President Putin to demand payment for oil in either gold or in U.S. dollars. With gold purchases, the gold is put into reserves for the future. With U.S. dollars, Putin is allegedly turning around all U.S. dollars and putting them immediately into the purchase of physical gold, which again goes into the reserves for the future. Assuming that this is true, it may be hard to see Russia suffering to any extreme from the lowering of oil prices. With more countries actively moving toward renewable energies and with Saudi Arabia allegedly aligning itself with the BRICS countries, and with the rapidly declining use and power of the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency, it would seem at this time that there are forces at work that are actively creating or collaborating to create conditions where the entities connected to the global banking cabal are being increasingly isolated and cut off from their main revenues used to fund their many covert activities worldwide. With BRICS-aligned countries securing more and more gold, this gold may become the carrot by which to entice the smaller, struggling oil-producing countries to join the BRICS alliance and move away from the U.S. dollar and NATO. With gold at $50, for example, there is no way that oil production in North America could ever be profitable. This situation forces one of two things. They will have to export oil and likely pay for it in gold, which means the cabal loses any gold reserves that may remain. Or the other option is that North American citizens and businesses take energy production into their own hands and begin moving towards renewables or even free energy devices to provide for their needs. Longtime listeners will know that there have been messages from our galactic families via various individuals suggesting that change cannot happen unless the people want change. As well, there is only a limited extent to which outside forces would be allowed to affect outcomes on a global scale. In order to prevent mass panic and chaos, change is going to happen slowly and in a calculated manner, but at the same time, as quick as possible to prevent the global cabal from succeeding in desperate attempts to secure power again through fearful, warmongered, false flag events on a global scale. What we may be witnessing at this time are the beginning changes that are becoming more visible to the mainstream public, although most people will not be able to associate the price of oil to another significantly greater event in human and planetary consciousness. For those people, smaller steps will still be required. For those more aware, the key is to continue anchoring the energies for positive global change while continuing also to be the example of courage in being the example of strength, comfort, and calm amidst the perceived economic storms. In general news, whether you like him or hate him, there is no denying that Nigel Farage knows how to get into the face of those who are aligned to the global cabal. It took Fox News a long time to catch up, but last summer they did an interview with Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party. UKIP, as it is also known, has been gaining in popularity among Britons and is beginning to scare the current establishment, following several by-election victories that are now giving UKIP a presence within Parliament. Farage himself sits as a member on the European Parliament, and Fox News replayed quotes made by Farage back in 2010 as Farage welcomed the newly appointed and unelected leader of the European Council, the governing body that carries most of the real decision-making weight within the EU. Here is how Farage welcomed Herman Van Rompuy, and following that are his comments to Fox News about why he did that and what he wants the people of the US, and indeed the world, to know.
And I'm sorry, but after that performance earlier that you gave, and I don't want to be rude, but, you know, really, you have the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. And the question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask is, who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you. I would like to ask you, President, who voted for you?
Years ago, seeing the dangers of a European Commission, a whole union that we learned present day isn't what it was cracked up to be. The leader of the UK Independence Party, Nigel Farage. Nigel, good to have you.
Thank you very much.
Who were you specifically addressing? The unelected, as yet not sworn in president, right?
Yeah, that little dull man that I was talking to there with the glasses.
Who was sweating profusely.
Yeah, he wasn't a happy bunny, was he, at all? He had just been appointed, and I repeat, appointed, the President of Europe. The President of 500 million people, a nondescript bureaucrat named Herman Van Rompuy.
He looks like Professor Irwin Corey, but I digress. Your point was, what are we doing here?
My point was, I mean, I don't want to live in the United States of Europe anyway, because I think that Europe has such different countries, different languages, different histories. But if you were going to build a United States of Europe, surely you wouldn't turn the clock back 1,000 years and abolish democracy and finish up with a president that had been appointed and who cannot be removed. And that was my basic point.
But you got penalized for those remarks.
Yes, they fined me. It was the maximum.
Who fined you?
The European Parliament themselves fined me, and it was the maximum fine that the Parliament imposed. It was 3,000 euros.
And you paid it?
I paid it. I had no choice. They just docked it out of my money.
Really?
But yeah. And this brings into question.
For warning about the very things that are now causing riots across Greece and Europe today.
Oh, riots, and I think much worse to come, to be honest.
Why do you say that?
Listen, if you were Greek, I mean, the country that actually invented democracy, and I know the Greeks don't pay their taxes and they have a different culture, but Greece is now ruled by 3 foreign bureaucrats. One from the European Commission, one from the European Central Bank, and one from the IMF, an organisation who's, I'm afraid, gone downhill along with the European Commission.
The same IMF, by the way, that says the world's in for stinkier times, right?
Yes, it does say that today. But
that you agree with?
That I agree with, but what I find extraordinary is that America, of course, provides 18% of the money for the IMF, so American money is actually being used to prop up.
So what would you tell us to do, Nigel?
I would say to you, get a grip. You are the biggest player with the IMF. Get a grip. Get rid of this awful woman, Christine Lagarde, who has turned the IMF effectively into an offshore post of the European Commission.
Well, she's been criticizing the way we conduct our fiscal policy in the United States. Some of the criticism was warranted, but she goes after the very people who are trying to correct it, which makes me think she's taking time.
And paying her vast salary on which she pays no tax. You know, the great battle that's going on, and it's happening in America, it's happening in Europe, this battle of bureaucracy versus democracy, and I want to get democracy back. And people like Herman Van Rompuy and Christine Lagarde at the IMF should not be calling the shots.
Do you get a sense, though, that all the world has hit an inflection point? More government, less government. And that's same in the United States. That's the essence of our election 4 weeks from today. Or am I oversimplifying?
Well, the big difference is this. You actually have an election debate. You know, you can vote for a candidate that goes to Washington and fundamentally changes the tax structure, bureaucracy, the legislation in this country. What's happened in Europe is nation-state democracy has been subverted totally and given to people like the European president. And it doesn't matter how we vote in a British general election, because all we're doing is we're putting into 10 Downing Street a manager, a caretaker.
Yeah, but can I talk to you about some of these characters? You're a huge exception, my friend. They always blame us, like this Barrasso character. I want you to listen to this, because I know you have some strong views on this fellow. Some of you might be familiar.
This crisis was not originated in Europe. Since you mentioned North America, this crisis was originated in North America.
Idiot.
I thought he was an idiot, too. Because here's the thing. He sounded French there. I know he's Portuguese, but I know he's lived all over Europe. But we consider him French with the attitude.
Could I just remind people, forget whether he's French, forget whether he's Portuguese.
He's condescending.
He's a former communist. All right?
Really?
So, yeah, he was a Maoist. You know, the most extreme form of communism. Nope. And the European...
I had my suspicions.
The European government is dominated by communists and dominated by people that hate...
Well, why can't guys like you get a role, a prominent role, instead of always being fine?
Well, I've got a prominent role.
I know that. You're here.
I'm one of the 7 group leaders in the European Parliament.
But their way is the winning way.
Well, at the moment, they've got the majority. But there is a democratic revolution taking place across Northern Europe. In a country like Finland, a party called the True Finns, who are against the bailouts and against this whole crazy system of surrendering democracy, nearly won the general election last year. My party, UKIP, back in the United Kingdom, we've now overtaken the Lib Dems, and we're 3rd in the polls. There is hope, there is optimism. All people need to do is to stand up and start voting differently.
Farage, as you heard, has noted that a democratic revolution is taking place around the world, and it would be wise for the people of North America especially to begin paying attention to events around the world from sources other than their mainstream media, and begin to feel empowered that humanity is in fact beginning to exercise a collective voice for global change that is shifting the paradigm of how we are perceiving and creating our world. What may be of particular interest to some listeners is a video surfacing on December the 12th showing an appearance of both Russell Brand and Nigel Farage on the BBC program Question Time. In a late development to this story, it seems that Russell Brand has something against Nigel Farage, and perhaps vice versa also. I have not had time to review the video, but the fact that 2 outspoken personalities against the establishment that seem to question the motives of the other begins to raise a question of who is truly serving the highest good. It might seem that Farage and Brand should work together in their mutual interest if it is indeed the same mutual interest that they share. I am refraining from comment at this time as I have not been able to adequately reflect on the events that took place in this program, and I do not feel qualified yet to even make a comment. Maybe it was a staged event to pull more people into the debate of political change. Regardless of how I may feel personally, it is, of course, up to each listener, him or herself, to discern whom she or he feels to be of the higher integrity in the current moment of now. In disclosure-related news for this week, the campaign to support and promote a U.S. congressional hearing on the disclosure of the ET presence on Earth continues to pick up steam. The Tweet Storm campaign has resulted in varying degrees of success. As the Tweet Storm initiative continues, the overall campaign to push for disclosure is gearing up for its next phase. Another petition will be posted on the White House petition website on January 7th, next month. The petition will require 100,000 signatures to get an official response from the White House. Several years ago, when the White House first started receiving petitions, the number of signatures requiring a response has steadily risen. suggesting that whomever is directly responsible for the petitions wants to make it harder and harder for certain groups to get an official response for their topic. The first petition put out by Stephen Bassett and the Paradigm Research Group required 5,000 signatures, which was easily achieved. At that time, the official White House response was that there was no concrete evidence to suggest that life existed beyond Earth. Shortly after that, the ceiling was raised to 25,000 and ultimately to its current ceiling of 100,000 signatures. With the growing success of various initiatives, including the citizen hearing on disclosure, there is a growing collection of voices within Washington for the disclosure of this information. Stephen Bassett, speaking at a conference earlier this year on the theme of the Secret Space Program, commented on disclosure.
If the question is, what is the next step in getting to the truth of the matter on these issues, I think there's hardly anybody in this room doesn't know what my answer is. The next step, assuming another nation, major nation, doesn't take independent action, is to maneuver the U.S. government, which in this case really means the executive branch, the President and the Pentagon, into a position where they have to acknowledge and announce the extraterrestrial presence, which is disclosure, the disclosure event. That's all it is. It's not dumping 4,000 boxes of files or revealing how many condos and Corvettes the Nazis got when they came under paperclip. It just means that there's an ET presence. Now, give us a few moments or a few days to think about what we want to say next. That's all it is. And it's a very simple thing. And because it's a simple thing, with the right moves on the chessboard, you can actually make it happen. And I happen to believe that it's ready to happen, and it can happen this year. And I talk a lot about that a lot, meaning that the necessary moves to get the President of the United States to cut a deal with the Pentagon so that both sides are relatively happy with how it's going to be done will come in front of the American people and announce the ET presence. Now, guess what? After that, all hell breaks loose, and a lot of stuff starts getting resolved very quickly. The truth embargo, which I casually refer to, was a massive program in which billions upon billions of dollars were spent, not only to keep the research secret, to keep the finances secret, and to keep the media under control, and the philanthropists out of the picture, and the universities pretty much out of the picture. A major 67-year effort that is unparalleled in history. And then the actual history of the phenomena and the ET presence, and of course all the scientific research, is vast. So we're sitting on this huge historical reality, which is not available in schools to learn about, and isn't going to be until the disclosure event takes place. So it's really kind of an odd situation. It's like there's this giant hole in the last 67 years of reality, and we're supposed to sort of not know about that, and then just sort of marvel at the things that are happening. We don't know why. Why did we suddenly end the moon program? Why is the shuttle program suddenly not there? And 100 other things. Oh, well, it's just the way it is. Oh, no. It's part of a large picture. Most of the picture just isn't available at your movie theater right now. One of the very possible reasons why the secrecy has been so profoundly maintained is that the power of the energy systems and technology that's being worked on, as well as the anti-gravitic technology, if it gets in the wrong hands, could be a serious problem. I'd like to mention something to you may have forgotten about. Back in 1991, 92, actually slightly before 91, there were articles which I read that the military was kind of had a problem in that they had been developing a huge range of very sophisticated weapons and were very frustrated that there wasn't a war that they could use them in. There just hadn't been one for a while. Interestingly enough, about the same time I was reading this article, April Glaspie, whatever his name is, one of the diplomats working with Bush, turns up in Saddam Hussein's office and gives him a little wink nod about, you want to go in Kuwait? It's like, we don't care. And the next thing, he goes into Kuwait, and the next thing you know, we're at war. But nothing like I'd ever seen before. We were at war, And so we're getting the feedback from the war, and of course we're killing lots of people, but that was really wasn't the key thing. What was, we were getting day after day after day of some generals, usually Schwarzkopf or some colonels, saying, here's today's footage. Here is this gun, the nose camera footage from a guided missile launched by a stealth plane 400 miles away. Here it comes in. Here's the bridge it's going to blow up. Oh, there's a bicycle going across. Boom, blows up the bridge. Or the house, or the car. And they're just having a hell of a time showing off the incredibly sophisticated weapons, stealth, camera technology, guided, all this stuff. In other words, they had a chance to really use those weapons, and it was on some Iraqis who had stepped over the line, and you gotta break a few eggs. And it finally got so bad that they stopped it because they were getting a lot of negative feedback from Americans. Are going, you're just showing off just a touch too much here, right? I mean, these are dead people at the end of these weapons. So the point I want to make is this. Joseph Farrell made a key point that maybe the secrecy is because these weapons, if they get in the wrong hands, could be dangerous. I would like to make the suggestion that they are already in the wrong hands.
The citizen hearing on disclosure was, allegedly, the most concentrated body of evidence and testimony ever put into one place at one time. The following information comes from the official trailer of the documentary Truth Embargo.
The conclusion I've come to is incredibly wild, that those in charge have been successful in keeping secret the greatest story of mankind.
The evidence is overwhelming that Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft.
The CIA guy standing next to me says, we're confiscating all this data, and you're all sworn to secrecy.
They've all been studying this. They have more data than I do.
The government has dumped disinformation and misinformation into the field for decades. They've undermined research.
I have lost faith in representative government. I truly think we're in gridlock. It doesn't work, and so we need to make a change.
I think it's ignorant of any people not to seek out what we need to know to continue the universe.
You give this committee a lot of reasons for us to say, open those files.
You're walking up to it and you touch it. What do you do? Touch it that? Do you grab it? Tell us about that.
Okay. I started doing the walk around 360 of the object, and as I came around, I seen there was an inscription on the front, and
this is what you saw, right?
That's what I saw. So I started walking around the craft, and I seen the glyphs, and as I ran my hand from the fabric of the craft, it was smooth to touch.
You ran your hands along it?
Oh, yeah.
I believe that the time is now to lift the veil of secrecy that has shrouded this subject for over 60 years, and the subject of UFOs should now be openly accepted in the mainstream media.
They exist, they are here to save us against the insanity of our leaders.
I agree with you. They should open those Roswell files.
There's only one way to regain trust. Find and tell the truth.
If it's out there, if it's real, we have a right to know.
CVN will be supporting the White House petition campaign for the month of January to encourage as many people as possible to support this petition. By increasing the threshold of the number of signatures required, it is clear that there is a concern about the number of people who are choosing to exercise their right to vote. Therefore, this action not only indicates the fear within the powers that be that they will have to officially comment further, but it is also a strong indication of the increasing numbers of people worldwide who are choosing to vote, and that this power is having an impact on those in positions of power and control. This momentum can be continued, and CVN gently but strongly encourages you to lend your support next month when this initiative launches. Stay tuned to CVN for more details early in January. Taking a look at science-related news for this week now. Science in general has slowly been accepting the fact that everything is energy, and that this energy is interconnected. Loosely speaking, science has been able to establish that we are all one, and that we are all energy, and that all energies act and interact on multiple levels. This has been pretty much established over the last decade or so at least, although it might appear that scientists have been gagged by higher powers from advertising these kinds of discoveries and revelations. Science is now generally coming to an expanded conclusion from this previous information. Information appears to be leaking out that science is being forced to concede that there is some form of consciousness behind the reality that we are experiencing. An article appearing on the Collective Evolution website on December the 11th by Arjun Walia writes that consciousness creates reality, a statement that has gained a lot of attention across various alternative media outlets around the world. Make no mistake, consciousness has been, for quite some time, studied by numerous scientists, especially in its relation to quantum physics and how it might be correlated with the nature of our reality. What is consciousness? Consciousness includes a number of things. It's how we perceive our world, our thoughts, being aware, our intentions, and more. Nassim Haramein, Director of Research for the Resonance Project, has been quoted as saying that looking for consciousness in the brain is like looking in the radio for the announcer. Max Planck, theoretical physicist who originated quantum theory, which won him the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1918, has known and communicated these theories since the early 1900s. Eugene Wigner, theoretical physicist and mathematician, he received a share of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1963 and has said that it was not possible to formulate the laws of quantum mechanics in a fully consistent way without reference to consciousness. In other words, people in positions of power have known this for a very, very long time and have not been communicating nor teaching it to the people of the world, for fear that humans would realize the inherent power within them on a mass scale and thus seek to destabilize the control the global cabal has had over humanity and our planet. Something, by the way, that is happening now. The collective human consciousness, just by focusing on change, is helping to manifest the physical reality now being birthed at this time. R.C. Henry, professor of physics and astronomy at Johns Hopkins University, has been quoted as saying this: "A fundamental conclusion of the new physics also acknowledges that the observer creates the reality. As observers, we are personally involved with the creation of our own reality. Physicists are being forced to admit that the universe is a mental construction." Pioneering physicist Sir James Jeans wrote, "The stream of knowledge is heading toward a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a giant thought than like a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter. Get over it and accept the inarguable conclusion. The universe is immaterial, mental, and spiritual." This supports an argument that science and spirituality coexist with varying degrees of dependence upon the other. The science behind explaining how consciousness and our physical world are interconnected was achieved through the quantum double-slit experiment. For many new listeners, this concept may be hard to grasp. A very popular 5-minute video on YouTube does an excellent job of explaining this. It is called the double-slit experiment and is explained in cartoon form by the fictional character Dr. Quantum. Valia's article goes on to ask how this information might be integrated into our lives to transform the world. Valia writes, "Change requires action, but the place within which that action comes from is most important. Modern-day science, especially quantum physics, has been catching up to ancient mysticism and concepts that are or were so deeply ingrained in various cultures throughout the ancient world. One great example of this is the fact that everything is energy and nothing is solid. A great example of quantum physics meeting ancient wisdom is seen in the fact that Nikola Tesla was influenced by Vedic philosophy when pondering his ideas of zero-point energy. One may ask why this is relevant, and Valia writes that it's relevant because new physics, as mentioned above, is pointing to the fact that the observer shapes the reality. The way we think and perceive could be responsible and play a vital role in the physical construct we see in front of us. Albert Einstein has been credited with saying that no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. Thankfully, we are witnessing more and more in the world the coming forward of leaders in different areas of specialty who are prepared and willing to demonstrate and practice this kind of outside of the paradigm thinking that has historically trapped and enslaved humanity. There are those who might try to argue that the trap that currently exists for humanity is just normal and that nothing can really be done, which may be true if one is willingly choosing to continue existing within that trap and that paradigm. A response to that might be that normal is relative to what one chooses to think, say, do, and be on a day-to-day regular basis. So in your day-to-day world, you get up and you perform your normal routine. Assuming that consciousness creates our reality, what is normal anymore? Ellen Goodman has said that normal is getting dressed in clothes that you buy for work and driving through traffic in a car that you are still paying for in order to get to the job you need to pay for the clothes and the car and the house you leave vacant all day so you can afford to live in it. One would have to argue, therefore, that there must be a better reality out there to be created by humanity, instead of being slaves to systems and groups that control the power we give away to them under the illusion of security. The show summary will include links to both the scientific document for the double-slit experiment for those who are more science-oriented, and also the cartoon explanation of the experiment for those seeking a general understanding. In health news, we look this week at the topic of sugar. Of course, most listeners will know that sugar is not good for us, although what many may not also realize is that sugars are being hidden even in the foods that are arguably healthy for us. Dr. Mercola, in an article on his website on December the 10th, has written that low-fat recommendations have led to a dramatic increase in sugar consumption, and excess sugar is a primary dietary factor in countless chronic disease states, including type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and Alzheimer's. By removing fat and adding sugar, the processed food industry has created a smorgasbord of made-to-order disease. The sugar, processed food, and beverage industries have been extremely reluctant to admit the health hazards associated with their sugar-laden products. On the contrary, large sums of money have been spent, and scientific integrity has been tossed by the wayside in order to convince you that sugar is fine. And if you have a weight problem, it's because you're not active enough. A group of scientists at 3 U.S. universities have banded together to offer independent research to the public and have created a new website called sugarscience.org. The information is hidden in plain sight. According to the website, there are at least 61 different names for sugar listed on food labels. These include common names such as sucrose and high fructose corn syrup, as well as barley malt, dextrose, maltose, and rice syrup, among many others. While product labels list total sugar content, manufacturers are not required to say whether that total includes added sugar, which makes it difficult to know how much of the total comes from added sugar and how much is naturally occurring in ingredients such as fruit or milk. That makes it very difficult to account for how much added sugar we're consuming. Mercola goes on in his article to write that the average American consumes around 20 teaspoons of added sugar a day, which is more than 3 times the recommended amount. There's simply no doubt that this overconsumption of sugar is fueling the obesity and chronic disease epidemic we are currently struggling with. We're now seeing obesity in infants, strokes in 8-year-olds, heart attacks in 20-year-olds, and some 30-year-olds require renal dialysis to stay alive. Teens are now getting gastric bypass surgeries. What used to be called adult onset diabetes is now more often called type 2 diabetes, as it is no longer reserved for adults. What is wrong with this picture? It's the food. Instead of eating whole foods, in other words, real foods, the contemporary American diet typically consists mostly of sugar, highly processed grains, and a montage of chemicals that are anything but food. Children are surrounded by these fake foods every day, which have a very different effect on their bodies than real food. At the end of his article, Mercola adds an experiment conducted by Stefanie Barden, who collaborated in a study to investigate how the body processes different kinds of foods. The experiment was called Processed versus Whole Food, a visual demonstration. The 4-minute clip has video taken from within the stomach as the body processes different foods. The evidence is pretty compelling. The basic conclusion is this: most, if not all, Western governments do not really care about the health of its people, so long as they are allowing the kinds of foods that only contribute to illness and disease while profiting big medicine and big pharma. Therefore, the pressure lies on the people, being willing to call out politicians and hold them accountable, while only electing those who know what is going on and are demonstrating a willingness to stand up and speak out on behalf of those who elect them. By way of an announcement for this week, I am monitoring a story about alleged changes that Facebook is proposing for the 1st of January next year. Infowars.com has reported that after this date, anyone using the service is apparently consenting to having his or her private data monitored by intelligence agencies. Many have indicated a desire to move away from Facebook, and I am also considering this as well. I have begun setting up profiles on several other possible social media network sites, and it is my hope that many of you who do choose to leave Facebook will choose to connect with me or with CVN on various other social media, so you can continue receiving the show postings each week. Currently, either I, personally, or CVN has a presence on Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, and now a YouTube channel, where the newscast has been put together by a listener, Gordon. CVN is grateful to Gordon for the time he shares each week in putting this together so that many of you may access the newscast through this particular medium. I, or CVN, now also have a presence on several new social media networks. If you are a member of FaceUni, or LO, and now another site from Iceland called Scene, please feel free to reach out and connect so you can stay on top of show postings and news postings. If Facebook seeks to make me consent to the new terms on January 1st, I will be taking a look to see if there is truth to this report. If there appears to be truth to it, I may be considering shutting down my Facebook personal page and the CVN Facebook page. There is a YouTube video that I came across shortly before airtime that apparently is a tutorial about how to leave Facebook and why without deleting your account. The individual doing the tutorial apparently makes the claim that by following the tutorial one can leave Facebook on one's own terms without following the delete option in Facebook, which may not really mean delete. I was unable to evaluate the video in time for the newscast, so I have to suggest that the video be watched with your own discernment to guide you in using the information offered. Although I choose to believe that many of us are protected and that the global cabal is in the process of being shut down, there may still be a need to set the example. that I choose not to support Facebook and the revenue it receives from advertising that I have not consented to, and also the possible spying issue by various government agencies. Links to these various sites will be in the show summary if you wish to explore for yourself a new social media network to join. Please connect with me. If you do add me in your new social network, I would kindly appreciate your sharing the work of CVN if it is meaningful to do so that CVN can try to establish a greater global presence on the alternative social media networking sites around the world. And in this week's final words, if you're like me, and I'm quite sure that most of you are, at least in this sense, you have been having feelings of frustration, impatience, eagerness, fatigue, and a wide range of other feelings and emotions relating to global change not happening fast enough. For those of us who are able and willing to see through the illusion, we can see what is going on, and we want, and perhaps some of us pray, for global change. In last week's final words, I commented on how people often are willing to look anywhere else except within themselves for the changes that they want to see in the world. Whatever one wants to see in his or her outer world, one has to at least be willing to practice it to some degree, or to the best of one's ability in one's immediate world. Throughout history, those who have been raised in very religious households have experienced sadness and tragedies, and they have no doubt gone through their own dark nights of the soul, where they question their faith and question the divine creator in whom they have placed their faith and their lives. There are those who still need this experience, so I honor all souls who are still choosing the experience of religious attachment for the benefit of that soul's life path growth and soul contract fulfillment. I grew up attending church also. It was the United Church in Canada, and it was one of the more open-minded faiths in Canada. When I was really young, I found church to be very boring and the ministers not very entertaining. Suddenly, a new minister appeared on the scene, and he brought with him a new energy, and more importantly, a sense of humor to the church services. He made church fun again, and I became more active in the youth group, and we started performing musicals. It was a grounding that helped me at that time become the person I am today. As I grew, I moved away from religious practices because they were no longer resonating with me. This is not to say that the practice was wrong. It was just that I was not needing it any longer. I had begun evolving myself beyond the need to seek validation from within a particular religious belief, and I no longer wanted to be held down by rules and conditions that were becoming increasingly more in conflict with how I was choosing to see, feel, and experience a divine creator. I have recently heard that this minister has himself gone through his own spiritual crisis of sorts, and I believe that he has now left the church because he has perhaps begun to question some of the practices relating to everything that he had been taught to believe, accept, and preach without question or condition. Everything and everyone serves a purpose in some way, shape, or form, even if one is unable to see or understand this purpose in any current moment of now. As one experiences a spiritual crisis or a dark night of the soul, or goes through an experience of profound doubt relating to one's relation with life or with one's divine creator, certain questions will always come at some time or another. A few examples of these are: why does the divine creator allow bad things to happen to good people? Why does the divine creator allow young children or babies to die? Why is the divine creator allowing all of this to happen in our world? Why are these bad things happening to me? I am praying and praying for something, but the divine creator ignores me or doesn't listen to me. Does a divine creator even exist? Of course, one can replace the term divine creator with any other term that is more relevant to one's faith or practice. What religion has traditionally taught is fear and separation. We have been conditioned to think that we are separate from a divine creator, that we are separate from each other, and that we are separate from the sentient life form that is our planet and all life upon her. We have been conditioned to believe that this divine creator is a punishing deity and that we have to give our faith, our allegiance, our power, and our money to some religious entity to secure salvation. This has been the power over us, and it is the power that humanity is beginning to reawaken to and reclaim within themselves worldwide. Let's look at the questions posed a moment ago. Why do bad things happen to good people? The term bad is relative to the individual judging the experience. What is deemed bad in one's world may be totally insignificant in the world of another. I would offer that a divine creator does not allow bad things to happen to good people, but rather the divine creator is allowing one to choose to demonstrate strength and courage in the face of all challenges, because that soul has been found worthy enough to be an example for all others to follow in how to survive and move forward from any challenge one experiences. A challenge is a gift from the divine creator to allow one to demonstrate to others how to overcome. With the shifting earth energies at this time, and with the awakening human consciousness on a planetary scale, this is becoming easier and easier. Why are young children allowed to die? This is heartbreaking for the parent or the couple who are not willing to understand the bigger picture of the life path journey. Until one begins to grasp this concept that souls come for a period of time to bring certain lessons and experiences for others and for the soul itself, humans will only judge life from our lower consciousness limited perspective. We have been taught to accept trials or tragedies as punishment, and religions will use this to scare people into supporting a particular faith. A dying child is not a punishment. It doesn't have to be a punishment. That soul probably chose to come for a short period of time for its own growth, but also because of the lessons that could be gained by the surviving family members, if they chose to learn those lessons and move forward. Sadly, many people choose to fall into patterns of depression, grief, anger, resentment, blame, and this leads to breakdowns in family relations when it never needed to. Life always goes on, regardless of the period of time that life was experienced in our current 3D physical form. More and more humans are thankfully coming into this awareness also at this time. Why are these things happening in our world? We are only beginning to grasp an understanding of this concept. Historically, we have been taught that we are humans and that we are to seek a spiritual experience. We are now understanding that we are in fact spiritual beings having a human experience. This one little understanding by itself changes the whole perspective of the human experience and journey. We no longer see ourselves being punished for a lack of spiritual faith, but rather we see ourselves as owning the power of the divine creator within each of us, and that we can choose to create what we experience. And as we awaken further, we can consciously choose more and more to manifest what has been called the experience of heaven on earth. What is currently happening is because we have chosen and allowed it to happen, and we are being given the choice to create something else if we are ready, willing, and able to choose this. The same could be said for why bad things are happening to oneself. Everything is an experience for personal growth, personal accountability, and personal choice about how to learn and move forward in service to the highest good for all, including our planet. One is not being punished, but rather one is being given the opportunity to demonstrate courage and strength in overcoming any obstacle, and to demonstrate how to create something better, not only for oneself, but for humanity and our planet together. One prays for something from a divine creator and wonders why one does not receive it. There are several thoughts to consider here. One is the nature of the thing being prayed for. Are you praying for it because your ego wants you to pray for it? The ego will almost always guide one towards wanting and taking things only for oneself, without considering others or our planet. Is it a prayer based in selfishness or selflessness? The other is whether or not the thing being prayed for is really for one's highest good in that moment. One may pray for a particular outcome, believing that this is the outcome one wants, but one may not be aware of the consequences of that prayer in the coming moments of now. This again comes back to whether the prayer was selfish or selfless as well. There is a saying, be careful what you wish for because it just may come true. Some have had certain prayers or wishes come true only to regret it later because one did not have the foresight to see what the potential consequences may have been of that wish or prayer. We are all one, so the matrix of life receives all energies of all requests and prayers and tries to process these mini creations. It has been said that the divine creator hears all wishes and prayers. In this case, the divine creator will always respond, whether the answer is no, yes, or not yet. As far as to whether or not a divine creator exists, I cannot answer that for you. I can answer it as far as my own personal beliefs and experience, but ultimately it comes down to each individual and his or her own experience within this ever-evolving process that I call life capitalized. It is the all that is, the physical, the non-physical, the visible and the invisible that sustain all of us, not only on earth, but also beyond. Only you can define that experience to yourself in this current moment of now, relative to how you are choosing to see the world and create your experience at this time. Create a wonderful week until our next moment of now. So that is the unfolding consciousness news around the world this week. Cosmic Vision News is a part of the Inlight Radio group of programs. Links to stories used in this broadcast are published in the show summary on the blog at cosmicvisionnews.com, on the CVN Facebook page, and also on Twitter, Google+, FaceUni, Ello, and LinkedIn. Thank you for sharing your time with me. I'm Jeffrey West, reminding you that there are two ways of meeting the challenges of our times. You can alter the challenge, or you can alter yourself to transform it. Until our next moment of now, stay grounded in love, hold the vision of light and peace in your heart, and keep your eyes to the skies. Disclosure is unfolding all around you. Namaste.